What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Orange Crushing It podcast, a Jenks Island production. I'm your host, Ty McGee, and in today's episode, we'll be covering all of the offensive free agency targets for the Denver Broncos. Later this week, keep an eye out for a defensive version of this episode, but today we will focus on the running backs, wide receivers, and tight end positions, as well as the possible trade of Ben Powers and what a replacement for him could look like. So first up at the running back position, we're going to talk about two guys that would have been at the top of this list, but unfortunately, kind of became unavailable within the last 2 days. One of those guys being Breece Hall, who was franchise tagged by the New York Jets. There's still the option to maybe trade for him. I wouldn't love giving up a second-round pick for a guy like that, and that's probably the asking price if they franchise tagged him. So, that's kind of a moot point and just dead on the vine. The other guy was David Montgomery, who Denver allegedly was involved in trying to trade for, right? Houston sent an offer. Denver matched that with a fifth-round pick, and then Houston ended up matching that ultimately with an offensive lineman and a fourth-round pick, something that, the Detroit Lions just couldn't pass up on for a guy who's 20 years old, has a larger cap hit, and kind of had a drop in production this past season. They're going to give the ball to Jahmyr Gibbs more often. I kind of talked about why I thought David Montgomery would have been a good fit for the Denver Broncos in the last episode, so make sure you go check that out. But, it sucks because I thought that would have been a nice way to start the offseason. But giving up anything more than a fifth-round pick, giving up what Houston gave up was absurd. I think they kind of got robbed there, especially because I don't know who David Montgomery is running behind with them trading two offensive linemen in the same day as that. So, sucks to miss out on two of those guys. They're obviously great players. Pro Bowl caliber players. I thought, both would have done really, really well in the Denver Broncos offense. But nonetheless, there's a couple guys out there that I think really could make a big difference. The first being that, the Super Bowl MVP, Kenneth Walker. It's obvious that he would make a huge difference, right? You saw what he was able to do for Seattle's offense, especially in the postseason this last year. But, he's a guy that can run really well between the tackles, brings a bit of speed, kind of, an underrated pass catcher, and brings a lot of balance, in the offense where, like contact balance, right? Where he is able to extend plays because he is so, flexible and finds ways to just stay up off the ground when a lot of times you're like, all right, this guy's down, but he finds a way to kind of stay up. So, he brings just a different element to this offense where it's a little bit of the RJ Harvey-esque, where RJ is a very shifty guy, has shown the ability to have great contact balance and contact power and bounce off hits. But, that between the tackle running is something that we just don't have, right? It's what we had with J.K. Dobbins, but we were lacking that for the rest of the season once he went down. So I think Kenneth Walker would be an awesome add. It's rumored that he could be asking between $12 to $16 million. Seattle didn't tag him, but they are still rumored to want to try to re-sign him. The other two teams being Denver and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs don't have a ton of cap space and have a ton of holes. So I don't know if they would go after a running back, especially, with how bad their offensive line is. But I think Denver is kind of in a prime position to go after a guy like this who is an absolute difference maker, would be a difference maker for this offense. It's something that we kind of lack around Bo Nix. Courtland Sutton can be that at times, but I don't think we have, a real Pro Bowl, all-pro type of player. And I think Kenneth Walker has the ability to do that as a lead back in the Denver Broncos offense. With the offensive line that they have, with the scheme that we have, I think he'd be a great fit. Clint Kubiak, he's kind of in that West Coast style of offense. Sean Payton and Davis Webb, not far off from that. So I think there would be, a lot of similarities, and he'd be able to assimilate really well into this offense and provide a ton of support for Bo Nix. The other guys outside of that, it kind of is a drop-off for me from Kenneth Walker. One guy, Travis Etienne, rumored to be a target. I don't love it because I think he's kind of redundant with what RJ Harvey does as a pass catcher, as a kind of outside zone runner. He's a great player. I think he's better than RJ Harvey at this point in time, but I would rather, bet on RJ Harvey continuing to develop and acquiring an inside the tackles runner like we had with Dobbins last season. So I kind of, dead on the vine for me. Don't love that move. If we got him, I'm not going to be upset, but I think there's better ways to allocate your cap space and better ways to, kind of add to this running back room with a guy that I think, kind of he has a lot of potential. He kind of was looked over a lot in Atlanta, and it's Tyler Algier. His first year in Atlanta, I believe he was 1,000-yard rusher or close to it. And then they went out and added Bijan Robinson. And obviously, he's overlooked because Bijan is so awesome. And, they added a true difference maker in him. But I think Algier is kind of exactly what this offense needs at its core, right? Like a down the hill runner. K9 brings so much in a lot of different assets and would be a difference maker. But this guy would just be a good fit for the offense, right? A more powerful back, bigger guy, 25 years old, just like Kenneth Walker. And, you could probably get him for around 3 years, maybe $25 million. Not a bad deal overall. And I think that, he would be kind of the thunder to RJ Harvey's lightning, just like he was to Bijan Robinson this past season. So wouldn't hate that move. Seen that one a lot on Denver Broncos Twitter, so I know the fans definitely want him. I'm not as high on him, but I would like it for sure as a second option to Kenneth Walker. At the third spot, I think, it's kind of between Rico Dowdle and J.K. Dobbins. And it's kind of a take your pick, right? Rico Dowdle, he's kind of been passed up now after 2,000-yard seasons. That gives me some pause, some concern. What's going on there? Why are these teams kind of moving away from him during the season, after the season? We saw during the season, this past season with Carolina, they went back to Chuba Hubbard after he had such a long stretch of success. So what's going on there? But then, you got concerns about J.K. Dobbins as well, right? He has not played a full season and maybe ever in the league. I think maybe his rookie season, but he's always missed time. He looked great in the Denver offense last season, was third in rushing yards before he went down. But, not having him was the reason that we kind of weren't able to do much of anything against New England. Obviously you had the backup quarterback, but if you had a downhill runner in that snow, I think it would have been a lot easier. So do I lean towards Rico Dowdle a little bit? Yes, but I'd love that Dobbins has the chemistry in this offense, loved playing in Denver, so maybe I would put him at the third spot just because this is a guy that really loved the Denver Broncos. And I'm hopeful that, he would be able to play a full season and would come back really strong this year. And maybe that, involves giving RJ Harvey a little bit more carries, right? That didn't come until later in the season. It was kind of the Dobbins show for most of the season. But at the running back position, I think that's it for me. I think number one, I want Kenneth Walker. Number two, Tyler Algier. And number three, I'll put Dobbins with 4 at Rico Dowdle. I don't really want Travis Etienne, Kenneth Gainwell, right? I don't think that they fit what we need. We have that with RJ Harvey. So that's it on the running back position. Now at the wide receiver position, where I'm not sure that we'll add anyone. I had said maybe early in the offseason, try to trade for A.J. Brown, but the current ask is a first-round pick and a top 100 pick. That's just entirely too much for a guy that's a little bit older, has a big cap hit, and has proven to be a bit of not a locker room problem, but he's just been unhappy in Philly, and you don't want that to carry over. So to offer up, that much draft capital, not ideal, right? Didn't level with Brees, not going to level with AJ. I'd give up a second for him. I would even give up just maybe a first, but not another top 100 pick alongside that. So some of the other guys rumored, Alec Pierce, who, will be a free agent after the Indianapolis Colts transition tagged Daniel Jones. So he will be hitting free agency, but they do want to try to lock him up, and he might be in the $30 million range. I haven't really seen him rumored to Denver. I have seen, Bleacher Report say this would be a dream target. I get that he would provide, kind of that burner speed. He had 47 catches, 1,000 yards at some of the, I think him and Deshaun Jackson were the only guys to have that little amount of catches with 1,000 yards in the same season. So, he's obviously a great deep threat, but I'm not sure that is what this Denver Broncos offense needs. You have Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin also can provide you that. I'm not, not for $30 million. I'll say that. Another guy, that has been thrown around, maybe Romeo Doubs, a guy that's kind of, he's done well at times in Green Bay, but they have so many options that sometimes he flies under the radar. I think he would kind of be the same in Denver, though. I think Pat Bryant, Troy Franklin, Cortland Sutton's better than him, Marvin Mims, they're kind of all in that range as Romeo Doubs. And I think to spend premier dollar and on a wide receiver that's just going to kind of fall, in the mix and not be a difference maker, right? Like I mentioned, we're looking for difference makers like a Kenneth Walker or an AJ Brown, as previously mentioned. So I wouldn't hate the Romeo Dobbs move again, but like it depends on the dollar amount, and it's definitely not on my rankings of guys that I want. The number one guy would probably be outside of AJ Brown, Wan'Dale Robinson, who I think brings something that this Denver Broncos offense doesn't have, and that's a twitchiness out of the slot position. I think Marvin Mims brings that straight line threat, and Pep Ryan's a great route runner, but I don't think that either of them has that elite short speed quickness that Wan'Dale Robinson has when it comes to route running. Had a ton of targets, a ton of catches last season, was a 1,000-yard receiver. I think in an offense that, he was obviously the focal point with Malik Neighbors down, but it wasn't a great offense, right? And I think that he would step into immediately better offense. And if you can get him for the $20 to $25 million range, like Kenneth Walker, I think he brings something that this offense doesn't have and didn't have last season. And that's why I think he'd be such a big, difference maker. And the last guy would be Juwan Jennings, who I think you could get him for a lower cap hit than you could get maybe a Pierce and definitely a Pierce, but maybe a Dobbs. And would be more of a prototypical Sean Payton receiver. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. It's Juwan Jennings. He's a big physical guy, great run blocker, decent route runner. I think he kind of reminds me of like a better Lil Jordan Humphrey. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of Lil Jordan Humphrey. I think, he's kind of been a liability at times in the passing game, although he did catch a touchdown in our playoff game, but he dropped another one, right? And that game could have been, over with sooner, didn't have to go to overtime. Bo Nix doesn't get hurt. But nonetheless, we were in that situation. That's last season. So I think Juwan would be a decent add. And I wouldn't be surprised, like I said, because he is that prototypical Sean Payton receiver. But I think, the only guy that I really want from the receiver position is Wan'Dale Robinson. A little different than the running back spot where I think we desperately need a downhill runner. So there's more guys on that list. But I think you have, the ability to draft a guy or, just let your guys develop at the receiver position because there's talent there. It's just they have to step up, especially a guy like Troy Franklin who has Pro Bowl aspirations, has All-Pro aspirations, and can get there with Ronald Curry. But I think Wan'Dale would be a great add. Now onto the tight ends position. I think this is a shorter list. I know Denver Broncos fans have said things about wanting to add to the tight end position. I'm not as keen on it unless it's maybe in the third round, second round, or Kenyon Sadiq in the first. I think you have Evan Ingram. You give him some another year in this offense under Davis Webb, who he had a lot of success, calling plays in the preseason for Evan Ingram. And I think if you're going to throw some big money at a tight end, this class isn't, it doesn't move the needle for me. I think, the first guy that the name's been thrown around, there's possible interest would be Dallas Goedert. I think, he's a top tier tight end, right? And, he's a great run blocker, decent pass catcher, right? But, a little bit better than decent pass catcher. I'll give him some credit. He's a good tight end. I just don't think he's quite the difference maker. He's not a top 5 guy. He kind of, I think he's a better version of Adam Troutman. I think a lot better version, but I don't think that's what we need at the tight end position. I think you can get a good run blocker for cheap, and then you can go out and get an elite pass catcher like a Kenyon Sadiq, or just trust that Evan Ingram can kind of grow in this offense. We don't have a ton of money, right? And if we restructure some guys, we can go out and spend some money. I'd way rather spend it on Wan'Dale or one of those running backs than go out and spend it on Goddard or some of the, defensive targets that I'll talk about in a couple of days. So not keen on Goddard, especially because I know he's going to require a larger contract as, one of the probably the top tight end out on the market. And the other guy's Cade Otton, and definitely doesn't move the needle for me. I think he has had some moments in Tampa Bay, and obviously there's a ton of targets in Tampa Bay that kind of take away from him. But I'm sure he's due for a big payday. And again, I don't want to pay 2 tight ends. We already paid Evan Ingram last season. We're not going to move on from him. Bet on him, draft a guy, or sign a guy with a little bit more upside for a smaller contract. But Cade Otton, I think, is going to get paid a decent amount of money. And, it's just listen, if we're going to this offseason, right, you saw the video that I made the first week of the Orange Crushing podcast. And if you did not, make sure you go check it out. Clearly I targeted the running back position and 2, positions on defense at linebacker and the defensive line. I'm not really, wanting to spend money on the tight end position between Dallas Goedert and Cade Otton. And I think outside of that, I don't want Isaiah Likely. I don't want, a Chigakwanku. I think these two guys would be the guys that I would want if George Payton was like, all right, we need a tight end, we need to add to the tight end position. But I think it's nothing that really moves the needle like a Wan'Dale would, like a Kenneth Walker would, or the need of just getting a power back. So overall, I think the offensive side has less targets than I think I'll mention on the defensive side in a couple episodes, not in terms of the positions or just the guys that we could target, but guys that we need to go after, right? I think the linebacker position has several guys that, are top tier talents, are stars, and I'd be willing to pay a lot of money for. The defensive line position has a couple guys out there that, I'd be willing to go after, and mostly in the draft as well. I mentioned Lee Hunter, I mentioned Caleb Banks, but I think the defensive side is it's shocking to say, right? I think it's a bigger need because I think if you can continue to make this defense more dominant, right, it's so hard to beat. You look at what Seattle did. I think that they're a great model, and we were almost the model as well. If you have such a good defense and you have a good quarterback and you surround him with, decent options and a good offensive line, you can go really far. Do I want us to add more options around Bo Nix? Yes. It's just the fact that there's not many elite options out there, right? Like it's Kenneth Walker. It's swing a trade for Breece Hall for too much and then have to pay him a ton of money. It's swing a trade for A.J. Brown and pay him, a ton of money and give up a ton of capital, or go after a Wan'Dale. And I think, for me, the two guys would be target on day one, Wan'Dale Robinson, Kenneth Walker. If you can add both of them, amazing. Go bring back Alex Singleton at the linebacker position. You can afford to not, get a ton better, draft a guy in the second round, in the first round, draft a defensive tackle. But I don't know that we'll be able to sign both of those guys, with Wan'Dale probably at 20 to 25 and K9 at the higher end of the running back market. But if you could, it's amazing. If not, maybe a Wan'Dale and an Algier, or a Wan'Dale and a Dobbins on a cheaper contract. But there's options. I think there's options to improve this offense. It's just not as abundant as maybe we would want, considering some of the needs on the offensive, side of the football. Last up, we'll talk a little bit about Ben Powers. Ben Powers, there's been rumors that he may be involved in a trade this offseason. He's got a big cap hit, and he missed some time last season. We had Palczewski step in, and he did a great job. We got a great offensive line coach in Zach Strief, who does a great job with the run game. And, Davis was scheming up with the pass game, with John Morton stepping into that position now. So, I believe in this offensive line, no matter kind of who's at that guard position, because there's a lot of great guys around him. You got Bowles, you got Wattenberg right there, and then obviously on the right side, McGlinchey and Minor. So I think you can afford to move on from Ben Powers. And this is something that I suggested in the first episode of the Orange Crushing It podcast. I had Ben as a cut candidate, a post June 1 cut candidate, kind of spread out that cap a little bit. And I think, that still makes sense. But if you can get some draft capital out of it or include him in another trade, now I don't know kind of what you'd be trading for. Maybe a running back. And I thought that would have made sense with Detroit, kind of like we saw, Houston do with Juice Scruggs. Where else could Ben Powers go? There's some other options. I just don't know that you're going to get anything more than draft capital. So I'm okay with moving on from him. He's done a great job in Denver since we signed him, been a huge part of the offensive line. But I'm only okay with it if you bring back Palczewski, who, we haven't reached out, or to our knowledge, we haven't tendered him, and we have not, heard anything about that or contract extensions. So a little concerning there, with the fact that hasn't come out yet, and we're talking about trading Ben Powers. Now, some things like tenders can fall under the radar, and you just kind of miss it. But the only way that I'm okay with getting rid of Ben Powers is if we bring back Palczewski. And I think, if that allows you to free up some space and go out and you get Kenneth Walker at the running back position, and he's your starting back, probably gets 75% of your carries. You give RJ Harvey some split there. You go out, you get Wan'Dale Robinson. He becomes your slot receiver, with Marvin Mims mixing in as that deep threat guy. Sutton and Franklin and Bryant on the outside. then I think you have an elite offense, right? I think you go from having a pretty good offense with needing some help to an elite offense because you got a running back who is easily 1,000-yard back, could be a 1,500-yard back in this offense, depending on how many carries he gets, what's the volume looking like, but just based on how well Dobbins played in the first half of the season. I think that K9 can do even better. He's a Super Bowl MVP candidate for crying out loud. I think he could be awesome. Dale could be easily a 1,000-yard receiver for you, maybe even a 100-catch guy, right? Because that's kind of what he can do out of the slot. I think we can get really creative with him as well in the screen game. Something that Sean Payton loves to do. It'll be interesting to see if Davis Webb loves to do it as well. And then you have a lot of continuity with bringing Palczewski back at the guard position. And like I said, I think that's an elite offensive line. You saved a ton of cap with getting rid of Ben Powers, and maybe you add some draft capital, right? Maybe you get a 5th or 6th round pick out of it. That's the ideal. We'll talk a little bit about the defense later on, and we'll talk about how does that merge with the offense, right? How do you get these great additions on the offensive side with great additions on the defensive side? Because if you do go out and you spend some money on Kenneth Walker and Wan'Dale Robinson, chances are you're not going to be able to spend big money on the defensive side as well. That's why I mentioned, I'd be fine with bringing back Singleton or Stranad at that point and drafting a linebacker and a defensive lineman in the first 2 rounds. But, we'll talk about what the best case scenario on defensive side looks. And if it's best case scenario on the defensive side, you're maybe looking at Algier or J.K. Dobbins, and probably not an add at the receiver position. So that's fine with me. You make big splashes on the defensive side, or in the first or second round, you go out and get a receiver and you get Algier. I think that the moral of the story is, and what the story of this offseason needs to be, is Denver needs to at least make 1 or 2 splashes, right? I'm fine with 1 splash if we just got Kenneth Walker and kind of brought back continuity on the defensive side, or Wan'Dale Robinson, right? But I think that you need to make a big splash and support your young quarterback and support your team that was in the AFC Championship game and was a step away from being in the Super Bowl. So that'll do it for this episode of the Orange Crushing It podcast. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Check out some of the other videos that'll be coming out from the Jenks Island network of podcasts. Right, Hammer has been dropping some stuff over on the Kurt Head podcast. Had a really good episode on Devin Lloyd, a guy that I also want Denver to target as well. We'll have a tight ends episode coming out tomorrow. Tight ends in the NFL draft. We'll give you our top 5. Then on Thursday, I will drop it'll be on Friday. I'll drop another episode of the Orange Crushing podcast talking about the defensive side. And then the next day, you will get some free agency content from the Jenks Island podcast. We'll talk about some of our top guys and where we think they will land. So, ton of content coming out from the Jenks Island network of podcasts, pretty much every day at this point. I don't know if that'll be a consistent thing moving forward, but definitely keep an eye out for everything. A lot of good content coming out. Make sure you comment any of your thoughts on things that, maybe you want to hear from us, things you want us to cover, thoughts on maybe you didn't love some of my targets. Just, the engagement, we love it. We want to engage with you guys and hear your thoughts and kind of, work with you on what we think this whole, podcast should be. So like I said, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Go check out my social media at Orange Crushing It or Orange_Crushing It on X, Instagram, and TikTok. And see you guys next time.